All right, so we're going to try to understand Robert F. Kennedy Jr. today, a figure who seems to attract controversy kind of everywhere he goes. We've got a stack of sources here for this deep dive, including some excerpts from his Wikipedia page. And we're going to take a look at his life, his work, and some of those, really strongly held beliefs.
What I think is interesting about RFK Jr. is that he kind of embodies this paradox. You've got a Kennedy who is so passionate about fighting for environmental causes, but at the same time, he promotes views that often put him at odds with the scientific community.
Yeah, it's definitely a tough one to figure out. So to understand how we got to this point, let's start at the beginning. Born into the Kennedy family, right? That's political royalty. Son of Robert F. Kennedy, nephew of JFK.
It's a name that carries a lot of weight, both in terms of legacy and expectation.
Yeah.
But you have to think about his early life. It was marked by events that would impact anyone. Imagine losing your uncle, the president, to an assassination when you're only 9 years old. And then having to go through the assassination of your own father at the age of 14.
Yeah, that's an incredible amount of trauma to have to go through at such a young age. And it seems like those early years were really turbulent for him. Drug use, expulsions from school. He even earned the nickname the Hyannisport Terror. Not exactly the picture of a well-adjusted Kennedy heir.
It's a reminder that even those born into privilege face their own struggles. But what's remarkable is that he turned things around. He eventually earned a law degree and chose to focus on environmental law, which I think is fascinating.
Okay, so that's where the passion for environmentalism comes in. Tell me more about that.
His early work with Riverkeeper is really important. It's an organization dedicated to protecting the Hudson River. He played a big part in bringing lawsuits against corporate polluters, and his efforts actually led to some landmark legal precedents in environmental law. This wasn't just about winning in court, it was about setting up protections with lasting impact.
So he wasn't afraid to go up against some big corporations, even if it meant a tough fight. And his environmental advocacy wasn't just limited to the U.S., right? He went global with it.
Absolutely. He was involved in helping indigenous tribes in Latin America, helping them protect their lands from exploitation. It showed a broader view of environmental issues and how they're connected with social justice and indigenous rights. It's a perspective that's become even more important in recent years.
Then there's his fight against the U.S. Navy over pollution in VX Puerto Rico. He actually served time in prison because of his activism. That's some serious commitment.
It shows how dedicated he was to environmental causes, willing to challenge these powerful institutions even within his own government. For him, protecting the environment was that important, even if it meant facing legal consequences.
He was also really vocal against dams all over the place, from Quebec to Patagonia. This is interesting because it put him at odds with other environmentalists. Some of them see hydropower as a cleaner energy source.
Yeah, his stance on dams shows just how complex these issues can be. There's rarely one easy solution when it comes to the environment. RFK Jr.'s argument was that these big dam projects displace communities, disrupt ecosystems, and do more harm than good. He really stuck to his guns on this issue, even with the opposition. It shows you how deeply he held these beliefs.
So we're starting to see a pattern here. He's not afraid of a fight, especially when it comes to the environment. But his views go beyond just protecting nature, right? His political views are also pretty central to his worldview.
Yeah, you're right. His environmentalism is really connected to his political beliefs. He's been a strong critic of economic inequality. He argues that pollution has a bigger impact on the poor and that it contributes to the decline of the middle class.
So it's not just about saving trees for him, it's about social justice too.
Exactly. He sees a direct connection between environmental problems and the struggles of working class people. It's something that people who feel like their well-being has been sacrificed for profit can relate to.
He's also been critical of U.S. foreign policy, especially military interventionism. He sees the military-industrial complex as a major threat. And he often argues that U.S. involvement abroad does more harm than good.
That actually ties into his environmental concerns. He sees large-scale military operations as destructive to both human life and the environment.
He's even raised concerns about how fair our elections are. He famously argued that the 2004 election was stolen, and he still talks about problems with our voting system. But here's where things get a bit complicated. Despite these views, he's gone on to endorse Donald Trump in the 2024 election.
It's definitely a twist, and it shows you how unpredictable politics can be. What they seem to have in common is this distrust of the establishment and a worry about whether elections are really fair.
It's a complex situation for sure. But before we get into his political moves, let's talk about what might be his most controversial stance: vaccines. RFK Jr. has become a leading figure in the anti-vaccine movement.
This is where his activism takes a turn that has led to a lot of criticism. He's the head of the Children's Health Defense. It's an organization known for spreading misinformation about vaccines and autism. Scientists agree that vaccines are safe and effective, so when he promotes these unfounded fears, it causes a lot of concern in the medical community.
And it's not just the medical community that's worried. Several members of his own family have come out against his anti-vaccine views. They say that what he's saying is causing real harm.
It shows how much influence someone like RFK Jr. can have. When someone with his platform repeats debunked claims, it makes those claims seem more legitimate. And that can really hurt public health efforts.
Okay, so we're going to have to unpack this vaccine issue more. And we'll also look deeper into his journey in politics. But for now, it's clear that RFK Jr. is a complicated guy, someone who's driven by strong beliefs, but also someone who embraces views that clash with established science and even his own family.
Exactly. It seems like we're only just starting to understand this complex and controversial figure. We really need to dig deeper into this vaccine thing. It shows the contradictions with RFK Jr. On one hand, he's this big fighter for environmental justice, willing to take on powerful groups, even go to jail for what he believes. But then on the other hand, he's pushing ideas that go against what scientists say about vaccines.
Yeah, it's hard to put those two things together. How did he end up with this anti-vaccine stance? What are some of his arguments?
Well, he's been talking about vaccine safety for a long time. He often talks about this idea that vaccines cause autism, which has been disproven.
Right.
This got more attention during COVID. He became a big voice questioning the COVID vaccines. He even promoted alternative treatments that weren't backed up by science.
And they got him banned from places like Instagram for spreading misinformation, right?
Exactly. These platforms had to do something about all the harmful stuff going around, especially when it came to public health. RFK Jr.'s claims were seen as a threat to vaccination efforts, and those efforts were super important for getting the pandemic under control.
What's really worrying is his focus on this medical racism conspiracy. He's been targeting Black communities with anti-vaccine stuff, using historical medical injustices to make people distrust the healthcare system.
And that's where it gets even more dangerous. He's taking real concerns about racial disparities in healthcare, and he's making that mistrust worse. This could stop people from getting vaccinated, and that can have serious consequences for public health, especially in communities that are already dealing with health inequities.
And it doesn't end there. He's repeated claims about HIV/AIDS denialism, too, which is something science has completely debunked.
Yeah, those claims have been condemned for undermining public health efforts. When it comes to HIV/AIDS prevention and treatment, it's a risky thing to do because it erodes trust in what we know about medicine, and that can put people in danger.
It's a lot to process. This vaccine issue has caused a big rift in his own family. Many of them have spoken out against his views. You mentioned that he endorsed Donald Trump in the 2024 election, even though he first tried to get the Democratic nomination and then ran as an independent. It seems like a strange move for someone with his background.
It's definitely a surprise. Their political ideas seem pretty different, but they both seem skeptical of government institutions, and they both appeal to people who feel left out by the political system. It makes you think about how politics are changing and how unusual alliances can form around these shared frustrations.
So how do we understand all of this? We have this environmental champion, a legal scholar, someone from a political dynasty, and he's promoting ideas that seem to go against what we know about vaccines and public health.
It shows how complicated people can be and how they can have many sides. It's easy to want to label people as good or bad, but it's much more nuanced than that. RFK Jr.'s life shows us that people can have both great qualities and beliefs that are really problematic and potentially harmful.
Besides all the politics and activism, what else can you tell us about RFK Jr. as a person?
Well, he's been married 3 times. One of his wives was the actress Cheryl Hines. And he's got some unusual hobbies like falconry and whitewater kayaking. It reminds you that even famous people have lives and interests outside of the news.
It is interesting to hear about those personal parts of his life. It makes him seem more human even with all the controversy.
Absolutely. It shows that people aren't just one thing. We all have our passions, our struggles, our complexities. RFK Jr. is no different.
He's also had some health issues over the years, things like a voice disorder and memory problems.
Those challenges add another layer to his story. They remind us that we're all vulnerable in some way, no matter our background or beliefs. It's important to be empathetic and understanding about these things.
And he's been a devout Catholic his whole life. He even wrote a biography of St. Francis of Assisi. He finds a spiritual connection in his environmental work.
That spiritual side adds something deeper to his environmentalism. For him, it's not just science and policy. It's also about a connection to nature and a responsibility to take care of it. This connection might also explain why he's skeptical of some aspects of modern society and technology.
But then there's the other side of things. There have been allegations of sexual assault and some odd incidents with dead animals, which makes things even more complicated.
We have to acknowledge these allegations and take them seriously. It's also important to remember that everyone deserves due process. These allegations should be investigated thoroughly before we jump to conclusions.
It's a lot to take in. This deep dive has been quite a ride. It's shown us a man full of contradictions and complexities.
It really has.
Yeah.
RFK Jr. is a fascinating example of how people can have admirable qualities and beliefs that are really worrisome and potentially harmful. It makes us think about how we judge public figures and how they affect society.
Makes you think about the whole legacy thing,
Yeah.
especially for someone like RFK Jr. with that Kennedy name. Does it help him get attention for good causes? Or does it make it hard to see him as just a regular person?
That's the big question. It's obvious that his family name has given him opportunities and access, things most people don't have. But it's also put him under a microscope. And maybe it's made him want to do things his own way, even if they're controversial.
It's interesting to think about how those tragedies in his early life affected him. Losing his father and uncle to assassinations. That must have changed his whole view of the world.
Definitely. When you go through something like that, you might start to distrust authority. You might feel like the world is dangerous and unpredictable. And that can show up in different ways, like fighting for the environment or questioning what the government is doing.
So where do we stand on RFK Jr. after all this? He's a complicated and controversial guy, for sure. He's dedicated his life to important causes. But he's also promoted harmful misinformation. How do we make sense of those two sides?
I think the main thing to remember is that people aren't always easy to put in a box. We can recognize and appreciate the work he's done for environmental justice. At the same time that we condemn what he said about vaccines and other things that aren't true, it's not about saying it's okay to have harmful beliefs. It's about trying to understand why he thinks the way he does.
What do you think is his biggest accomplishment? Is it his legal work with Riverkeeper, his support for indigenous communities, or something else entirely?
His work in environmental law early on was really groundbreaking. He helped set legal standards that protect the environment even today. And his idea of connecting environmentalism with social justice is really important these days.
But then there's the other side. The conspiracy theories, the anti-vaccine stuff, his support for Trump. Does that ruin his legacy, in your opinion?
It definitely makes things messy. It's hard to ignore the damage that spreading false information can do, especially when it comes to public health. People will probably argue about his legacy for a long time. Some will focus on his environmental work. Others will criticize him for promoting ideas that are dangerous.
It's a lot to consider. This deep dive has given us a look at a really fascinating and controversial person, and it leaves us with more questions than answers.
And that's what's great about learning, isn't it? It's not always about finding the right answer. It's about dealing with complicated stuff, challenging what we think, and always trying to understand the world and the people in it better.
I think that's a good place to wrap things up. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., a man of contradictions, complexities, and strong beliefs. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a place to start exploring this intriguing figure. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.